They spoke around me like I wasn't even there. They laughed at things I understood better than they ever would. Every word they said felt safe to them because they thought I was clueless. What they didn't realize was that their truth was already unraveling in front of me. Before I tell you how that silence changed everything, let me say this. If you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or treated like you didn't understand what was really going on, stay with me. And if stories like this matter to you, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Some truths don't need arguments. They need time. It started in a room I'd been in hundreds of times before. Same walls, same chairs, same people who thought they knew exactly who I was. They spoke freely when I was around, never lowering their voices, never checking their words. I was the quiet one, the observer, the one they thought didn't follow the conversation unless it was simplified. They were wrong. I noticed how they made decisions before discussing them, how they agreed in public and disagreed later, privately, how loyalty shifted depending on who was present. I noticed the pauses in conversation when certain names were mentioned, and how quickly the topic changed after. Most of all, I noticed how easily they lied to each other and to themselves. The betrayal didn't come in one moment. It came in patterns, small exclusions, side conversations I wasn't invited into, decisions announced as if they'd always been obvious. I was told things after they were finalized, never before. "You wouldn't get it," someone said once, smiling like they were doing me a favor. I nodded. That nod became my cover, because the truth was, I got it perfectly. I understood why they didn't want me involved, why it was easier to assume I didn't know anything than to risk me knowing too much. People are comfortable when they believe they control the narrative. I let them keep believing that. Over time, the conversations became bolder. They spoke about plans, about responsibility, about who mattered and who didn't. Sometimes they joked about me right in front of me, never cruelly, just dismissively, as if I was background noise. I didn't react. That unnerved some of them, not immediately, but subtly. Silence has a way of making people uncomfortable when they expect either agreement or resistance. One afternoon, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to, not because they whispered, because they didn't think I'd connect it to anything meaningful. A decision had been made without acknowledging its impact, a choice that benefited one person while quietly pushing someone else aside. Someone said, "He won't notice." They were talking about me. I felt something shift in that moment. Not anger, clarity, a calm awareness that the version of me they believed in was protecting them, and that as long as I stayed inside that version, they'd keep revealing themselves. So I stayed quiet. Days passed, then weeks. The pattern repeated. They relied on my silence, built confidence on it. They shared more, not less. They joked about transparency while practicing the opposite. I watched how one person positioned themselves as the decision maker without ever being questioned, how another played loyal while quietly undermining others. I watched trust be traded like currency, and I understood something important. The secret wasn't what they were doing. The secret was that they assumed no one noticed, especially not me. The revenge didn't form as a plan, it formed as patience. I didn't confront anyone, I didn't challenge their authority, I didn't correct their assumptions. I listened, and listening changes how you see people. You stop hearing what they say and start noticing why they say it, who they look at when they speak, who they avoid, where confidence ends and fear begins. One day, someone finally asked me what I thought about a decision they'd already made. It wasn't sincere, it was performative, a formality meant to confirm consensus. I paused before answering. I think it makes sense if all the information is accurate. The room went quiet for just a second. Not long, but long enough. What do you mean? Someone asked. I mean, it depends on what wasn't discussed. They laughed it off, changed the subject, but the laughter felt thinner this time. That was the first crack. After that, people started watching me differently, not closely, carefully, like they weren't sure anymore whether I was as unaware as they had assumed. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't speak more. I didn't explain myself. Consistency is dangerous to people who rely on underestimation. The moment came sooner than I expected. Not dramatic, not public, just inevitable. A situation escalated. Questions were asked from someone outside the room, someone who didn't accept half answers or inherited authority, someone who wanted clarity. Suddenly, the things I'd been quietly absorbing mattered. They needed context, timelines, explanations, and I had them, not because I had prepared for this, but because I had been present the entire time. When I was finally asked to speak, I didn't accuse anyone, I didn't expose secrets aggressively, I didn't frame myself as wronged. I simply told the truth, calmly, completely. The room didn't erupt, it fell silent. Not because I spoke loudly, but because the truth had been waiting, and silence had carried it safely to the moment it could no longer be ignored. And as that silence stretched, I realized something. They thought I didn't understand anything. What they were about to understand, slowly, uncomfortably, was that I had understood everything, and I had chosen to wait. And that waiting was only just beginning to show its consequences. Once the silence had settled, it didn't lift the way people expected it to. No one rushed to explain. No one joked to soften the moment. The truth has a way of doing that. When it finally lands, it doesn't ask permission to stay. The person who had asked the questions leaned back slightly, studying the room, not suspiciously, thoughtfully, like they were recalculating something they'd previously taken for granted. Others avoided eye contact. A few stared at the table. The confidence that had filled the space earlier drained away, replaced by something quieter and far more honest. I didn't feel powerful in that moment. I felt visible. That was new. Afterward, conversations became fragmented. People spoke in pairs instead of groups. They lowered their voices, not because they were hiding, but because they were unsure. Uncertainty had replaced certainty, and no one knew yet who was supposed to lead. I stayed where I was. I didn't move closer. I didn't retreat. I let the room reassemble itself without me forcing a role. That's when the second betrayal revealed itself. Someone approached me later and said, "You should have spoken up sooner." It was meant to sound supportive, but it wasn't. It was blame disguised as advice, as if the responsibility to prevent their discomfort had always been mine. I looked at them carefully. "I spoke when it mattered," I said. They didn't reply. That's when I realized something important. Silence isn't just something people underestimate. It's something they exploit until it stops working for them. In the days that followed, the atmosphere shifted completely. Decisions slowed, discussions reopened. Things that had been framed as settled were suddenly up for review, and the people who'd once dominated those conversations struggled to adjust. They weren't used to explaining themselves. I noticed how often phrases like, "we've always done it this way," came up, how quickly irritation replaced confidence when those phrases were questioned. Patterns that had once passed unnoticed now stood out clearly, and people started coming to me, quietly, one by one, not asking me to lead, asking me to confirm. "Did you notice that too? Am I overthinking this? Was that decision really fair?" I answered honestly. I didn't validate anger. I didn't amplify resentment. I just reflected what I'd seen. That consistency did something unexpected. It built trust, not because I had authority, but because I hadn't used silence as a shield or a weapon. I'd used it as a lens. The person who had dismissed me the most began avoiding me, not openly, subtly. They didn't want to risk another moment where my understanding might disrupt their narrative. They smiled less, spoke around me instead of over me. It didn't help, because the system no longer depended on them alone. The secret they'd been protecting wasn't a single action, it was a structure, a way of operating that relied on people like me being underestimated. Once that assumption collapsed, everything built on top of it became unstable. One afternoon, there was another discussion, smaller than the first, more focused. The same people were present, but the energy was different. No one rushed to speak first. No one filled the silence. Eventually, someone said, "Maybe we should hear from him." They meant me. No one objected. I didn't speak immediately. I waited. Not for effect, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't reacting to the moment. When I did speak, it wasn't dramatic. "I think we've been solving the wrong problem," I said. We've been asking how to move faster, not how to move honestly. The room stayed quiet. Then someone nodded. Then someone else asked a question. That's how it started. Not with confrontation, with curiosity. From that point on, nothing went back to the way it was. People were more careful with their words, not guarded, intentional. They explained decisions instead of announcing them. They asked instead of assuming. The people who'd relied on authority without accountability found themselves exposed, not because anyone attacked them, but because the environment no longer supported that behavior. I saw frustration surface. I saw defensiveness. I saw people struggle to adapt to a room that no longer rewarded volume over substance. And through it all, I stayed steady. I didn't remind anyone of the past. I didn't keep score. I didn't claim a win. Because revenge, when it's done right, doesn't feel like victory. It feels like balance being restored. There was a moment, weeks later, when someone tried to dismiss a concern the way they used to. They laughed lightly and said, "You're reading too much into it." Before I could respond, someone else said, "Maybe, but let's still talk about it." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. The truth was speaking now, not through me alone, but through the room. They had thought I didn't understand anything. What they were learning is that understanding doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly, letting people reveal exactly who they are. And once that happens, no explanation can put things back the way they were. The silence that once protected them had changed sides, and now it was holding them accountable. Which made the next stage inevitable, because once accountability enters a room, it starts asking questions no one can ignore. Those questions didn't come all at once. They arrived slowly, almost politely, the kind of questions that don't accuse, but don't let you hide either. People asked for clarification instead of agreement. They asked for reasoning instead of reassurance. And the people who'd once thrived on assumption suddenly found themselves exposed to scrutiny they'd never practiced surviving. I noticed how often conversations stopped mid-sentence now, how someone would start to say something the old way, then pause, correct themselves, choose different words. That pause mattered. It meant people were thinking before speaking. That had never been the case before. The ones who'd underestimated me struggled the most. One person in particular began pushing back, not openly, strategically. They framed questions as concerns, doubt as caution. They warned about overthinking and slowing things down. It was subtle resistance, but it was resistance all the same. I recognized it immediately. It was the same behavior I'd seen for months, just turned inward now, aimed at protecting position instead of dismissing me. They approached me privately one afternoon, voice lowered, tone controlled. "You've changed how people see things," they said. "That can be dangerous." I didn't react. I didn't ask what they meant. "Dangerous for who?" I asked instead. They hesitated, long enough to answer the question without speaking. That's when I realized the revenge wasn't about me being heard anymore. It was about people being forced to hear themselves. The betrayal cut deeper as time went on, not because of what they'd done, but because of how normal it had been to them. They hadn't seen themselves as dishonest or manipulative. They'd seen themselves as efficient, practical, necessary. They believed some voices mattered less. Mine just happened to be one of them. Once that belief was challenged, it spread to everything else they justified the same way. And that's when resistance turned into fear. Meetings grew longer, decisions took effort. Accountability doesn't move fast, it moves thoroughly. People had to explain histories, not just outcomes, motives, not just results. I watched some of them unravel under that pressure, not dramatically, quietly, confidence draining away each time they were asked to clarify something they never had to defend before. One evening, someone said, "We should document how we decide things now." The reaction was immediate. A few people nodded, a few stiffened. Structure scares people who rely on ambiguity. I didn't suggest it. I didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for me. I started to notice something else too. New alliances forming, not against anyone, but around shared values. People who'd once stayed quiet began backing each other up. They didn't need permission anymore. The environment had shifted enough that speaking up felt safe. That's when the power dynamic truly changed. Power doesn't disappear, it redistributes. The person who had once spoken over everyone now spoke less but louder when they did. Their words carried frustration. They repeated themselves more often, as if volume could replace authority. It didn't work. Others responded with calm questions, requests for clarification, neutral observations that revealed inconsistencies without calling them out directly. That kind of exposure is exhausting. I saw it take a toll. They avoided meetings, deferred decisions, claimed busyness. It was a retreat, but not a strategic one, more like someone backing away from a mirror they didn't want to look into anymore. And in that retreat, the system adjusted again. New voices filled the space, mine included. I spoke when something mattered. I stayed quiet when it didn't. I didn't rush to correct people. I let them finish, then asked questions that redirected the conversation towards substance. People trusted that, not because I was always right, but because I wasn't trying to win. The irony was that the people who'd once dismissed me now depended on my presence to keep discussions balanced. They watched my reactions, waited for my input, not because I demanded it, but because I'd proven I wouldn't misuse it. That's a strange feeling, to become necessary to the same system that once ignored you. It wasn't satisfying, it was sobering. One afternoon, someone admitted something out loud for the first time. I think we've been protecting habits instead of outcomes. No one argued. That sentence landed like a confession. I thought back to the early days, the laughter, the casual dismissal, the confidence with which they'd spoken around me, assuming I didn't understand anything. They hadn't been wrong in one thing. I hadn't understood at first. I'd learned, and learning quietly gave me the advantage none of them expected. The betrayal had sharpened my awareness, the silence had refined my patience, and the revenge, if it could even be called that, had unfolded without me lifting a hand, because the most effective revenge isn't destruction, it's exposure. As weeks passed, the environment stabilized, not into what it had been, but into something more resilient, more honest. People adjusted, some adapted, some withdrew. The ones who withdrew never said why. They didn't need to. The system no longer rewarded the behavior they were attached to. One evening, as a discussion wrapped up, someone joked lightly, "Remember when we thought he didn't understand any of this?" A few people smiled. Someone shook their head. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for me, and it was still speaking, because once people learn that silence doesn't mean ignorance, they stop taking comfort in assumptions. They start listening. Which meant the final stage was coming, the part where understanding turns into consequence. Not loud, not dramatic, but permanent. And that permanence was about to become impossible for anyone to deny. By then, the room had learned a new rhythm. Conversations no longer rushed to conclusions. People paused. They checked each other's reactions. They asked follow-up questions instead of filling silence with certainty. What once felt efficient now felt careless, and no one wanted to be careless anymore. That shift didn't come from rules or reminders. It came from memory. People remembered how wrong they'd been about me. And once you realize you misjudged someone completely, it changes how confident you feel about your other assumptions. The ones who had underestimated me most tried, in their own ways, to adapt. Some did it genuinely, others struggled. One person began over-explaining everything they said, as if transparency could be retroactively applied. Another leaned heavily into agreement, nodding at every opinion without offering one of their own. Those extremes didn't last. Balance eventually replaced them. I noticed that when discussions grew tense, eyes would flick toward me, not for approval, but for grounding. I'd become a reference point without ever asking to be one. That responsibility felt heavy at first, but it also felt honest. I didn't have to perform certainty. I just had to be consistent. And consistency is disarming. The person who had once laughed the loudest at my silence finally said something I hadn't expected. "I didn't think you cared," they admitted one afternoon. "You never reacted." I looked at them and answered truthfully. "I cared enough to pay attention." They nodded slowly, like they were recalibrating a memory. That's when it hit me. They hadn't mistaken my silence for ignorance. They'd mistaken it for indifference, and indifference is easier to dismiss than awareness. The betrayal I'd felt early on didn't linger anymore. not because it didn't matter, but because it had done its work. It had shown me exactly where assumptions lived and how deeply people depended on them. Once those assumptions cracked, everything else followed. There was a final moment, quiet, unceremonious, that sealed it all. A discussion reached a familiar crossroads. Someone proposed moving forward without revisiting earlier concerns. The old pattern would have pushed the decision through with a joke or a confident dismissal. This time, no one laughed. Someone said, "Let's slow down." Another added, "We don't want to repeat past mistakes." Then someone turned to me and asked, "Do you think we're missing anything?" I took a breath. "Yes," I said. "I think we're missing the people who haven't spoken yet." The room went still, not uncomfortable, but attentive. They listened, and people spoke. Voices that had never shaped decisions before entered the conversation, not aggressively, not defensively, just honestly. The discussion changed shape entirely. It became fuller, more complex, more real. When it ended, no one rushed out. No one declared victory. They just sat there for a moment, absorbing what had happened. That was the moment I knew it was over. Not the conflict, the assumption. They no longer believed silence meant nothing. They no longer believed understanding had to announce itself to be real. And they no longer believed they could speak freely around someone without consequence. The revenge was no longer mine. It belonged to the truth. Over time, people stopped referencing the past altogether, not because it was forgotten, but because it was integrated, the way you integrate a lesson you don't want to relearn. I didn't gain power, I gained trust, and trust changes rooms faster than authority ever could. Looking back, I understand why staying quiet was the right choice for me. Speaking too early would have protected their comfort. Reacting emotionally would have framed the truth as bias. Waiting allowed patterns to form, and patterns are harder to deny than opinions. They thought I didn't understand anything. What they didn't realize was that understanding isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient, sometimes it's observant, sometimes it waits until the moment when the truth can no longer be brushed aside. The silence I chose wasn't weakness, it was preparation. And when the truth finally spoke, it didn't need my voice anymore. The room already knew how to listen. That's the thing about underestimation. It creates space. And if you know how to use that space, you don't have to fight to be heard. You just have to wait long enough for the truth to become unavoidable. By the time they realized that, it was already too late to pretend otherwise. They listened because they had learned what silence can really mean.